The small town in New England lay still under a heavy gray sky with clouds sagging low as if burdened by the weight of an approaching snowstorm. Jack sat on the bus, staring out the window as rows of bare trees blurred past in the dim light of the late afternoon. The biting winter chill crept not just into his skin but deep into his core, bringing with it a familiar unwelcome unease at the thought of going home. As he stepped through the front door, Jack immediately sensed something was off. The house he once called home now felt like an empty shell. So quiet he could hear his shoes creak against the wooden floorboards. His mother, Sarah, stood in the kitchen with her back to him. The soft yellow glow of the overhead light cast her silhouette in sharp relief, painting a picture that was both familiar and strangely alien. "Your home," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah turned to him, her lips curling into a faint smile. But Jack couldn't miss the look in her eyes, deeply shadowed. "Weary as if she hadn't slept in days." "Hi, sweetheart," she replied, her voice soft but tinged with tension. A typical mother would have been thrilled to see her son after a holiday vacation. But Sarah appeared as though he had disturbed some secret. "Is anything wrong, Mom? I didn't think you'd be back so soon." Jack scowled, even though a prickly pain was already developing in his chest. Jack asked in a casual manner. Sarah shook her head and returned her attention to the sink, where she was cleaning dishes that didn't appear to be that dirty. "Not at all. I'm just surprised." Her words seemed straightforward enough, but the way she avoided looking into his eyes told a different story. Jack looked around, feeling uneasy all the time. Everything in the house seemed to be in its normal place, but something was strange that he couldn't identify. The silence and his mother's brief glance made him tense. "Are you okay?" Jack repeated the question, this time with a harder edge. And Sarah turned to face him. She stared at his face for a moment too long before forcing another grin. "Of course. Why wouldn't it be?" That well-practiced, meticulously constructed response that made Jack's stomach turn with suspicion as he gripped his suitcase and trudged upstairs, feeling as though he was entering a house that was no longer his. The wind outside howled an eerie wail through the trees, more like a warning than a natural sound. And Jack closed the door to his room, letting out a heavy breath. But the question wasn't gone from his mind. What is Mom concealing? That night Jack lay restless on his bed, trying to shake the goring unease that had settled deep within him. The house was eerily silent, broken only by the faint whistling of wind through the branches outside his window. He couldn't explain why. But the look in his mother's eyes when she greeted him earlier that day kept haunting him. It was as if she was hiding something, a secret too heavy to carry alone. Unable to take it anymore, Jack threw off his blanket and got up. The clock read just before midnight. But he didn't care. His legs moved almost on their own, carrying him down the dimly lit hallway. It was as though an invisible force was pulling him toward the old storage shed in the backyard, the place he and his dad used to keep things that no longer had a place in the house. The wooden door creaked loudly as he pushed it open. Inside, the stale scent of mildew and dust filled the air. But Jack barely noticed. He pulled out his phone, the beam of light from its flashlight cutting through the darkness and landing on piles of old boxes stacked haphazardly. With a heavy sigh, Jack stepped inside and began rifling through the boxes. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking for, but something told the answers lay here. In his hands brushed past childhood toys, old school books, and finally landed on a small wooden box tucked into the farthest corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. The box looked ancient, its rusty lock barely holding together. Jack grabbed a screwdriver lying nearby and pried it open. With a sharp snap inside, he found a stack of aged, yellowed papers, neatly folded letters. He picked one up, immediately noticing that the handwriting didn't belong to his father. His chest tightened as he unfolded it and read the first line. "Dearest Sarah." The letters were written by Michael, his father's best friend. The first one seemed innocent enough. Just words of encouragement and comfort to Sarah while Jack's father was away on business. But as he read further, the tone shifted. The words became more intimate, more personal, as though Michael wasn't just a friend, but something more. Jack's blood boiled as he scanned the next line. "Sarah, you've always been the light of my life." Why were these letters hidden here? They weren't just love letters, they were proof of a relationship that crossed boundaries. One letter even implied that the affair had continued while Jack's father was still alive. "I wish things could be different so he could truly follow." His hands trembled as he read the letters, and a sharp pain pierced his chest. Jack clutched one of the letters, wondering whether his father was aware of this. Who had placed them in this box? Michael or his mother? Was this the reason behind the accident that had claimed his life? Jack's emotions swirled into a chaotic storm of shock, anger, and betrayal. His mother, the person he had always trusted and admired, now stood before him in an entirely new and unsettling light. He wanted to storm upstairs and confront her, demanding answers, force her to explain every lie she'd kept from him. But another part of him hesitated, unsure if he was ready to face the truth. As his phone's flashlight swept across the pile of papers, it caught on a small slip of paper that had fallen loose. This wasn't one of the letters. It was a hastily scrawled note, the handwriting jagged as if written in a rush. "Jack will never know the truth unless I tell him." The word sent a chill through his body. Was this written by Michael or his father? Jack tightened his grip on the wooden box, his pulse pounding in his ears. He couldn't stay in the shed any longer. He needed airspace to think. But more than that, he needed answers. The secrets in this box couldn't remain buried any longer. Whatever the cost, he had to uncover the truth, even if it meant unraveling everything he thought he knew about his family. The next morning, as Jack fumbled around in the kitchen brewing his coffee, a sudden knock on the door echoed through the eerily quiet house, making him jump. Who would come by at this hour? The sky outside was still a pale gray, with snowflakes gently falling, blanketing the road in white. Jack set his coffee mug down on the counter and made his way to the door. When he opened it, a tall man in a long brown coat and a dark scarf stood before him. There was something familiar about his face, but Jack couldn't immediately place him. "Jack," the man said, his voice deep and warm but carrying a faint awkwardness. "You've grown so much. I don't recognize me, do you?" Frown, his eyes scanning the man's face once again. And suddenly it dawned on him. Was Michael the best friend of his father? "Michael?" Jack questioned, his voice laced with surprise. "It's me," with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's me," said Michael. Jack, the guy who had previously been a mainstay of their family portraits but had all but disappeared from their life following his father's death. Jack didn't miss the way her gaze darted between Michael and the ground, avoiding him entirely. "Michael," Sarah said, her voice trying to maintain composure but faltering slightly. "How are you doing here?" "Michael, I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to see how you two are doing." Before Jack could respond, Sarah's appearance changed everything. Her body tensed the moment her eyes landed on Michael, and the forced smile on her lips did little to hide the wave of unease that swept across her face. Raised an eyebrow, his tone almost casual, as though her question surprised him. "I just wanted to check in on you too. It's been a long time." He paused, his eyes lingering on Sarah with an intensity that Jack couldn't quite decipher. "And I figured it's time we had a conversation." Jack stood rooted in place, his eyes bouncing between Michael and his mother. The tension between them was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah's unease, the tremor in her voice, the way she avoided Michael's gaze, none of this was normal. Jack had never seen her act like this. Not even in the most uncomfortable situations. It was as if some invisible thread of secrets hung between them, ready to snap. "Jack, could you go upstairs?" Sarah said suddenly, her voice a mix of a plea and a command. She turned to him, her expression almost begging. "Michael and I need to talk alone." It was the last thing Jack wanted to do. But he nodded reluctantly. "Fine," he said, his tone sharp, the words leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He climbed the stairs halfway. But instead of heading to his room, he stopped at the landing, crouching in the shadowed corner where he could hear every word. "You shouldn't have come here," Sarah said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You know that, Sarah. You can't keep running from this," Michael replied, his tone firm and unwavering. "I can't keep pretending that nothing ever happened. We need to face this." "There's nothing to face," Sarah nearly shouted, but she quickly lowered her voice. "Don't you understand? It's over? It's been over for a long time. Then why do you still have the letters?" Michael's question hit like a thunderclap, and Jack felt his breath hitch. "You didn't burn them. You didn't throw them away. You hid them. Don't tell me they don't mean anything to you." Sarah didn't respond right away. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Jack could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Letters, were they talking about the ones he had found the night before, the ones written by Michael? His pulse quickened, his grip tightening on the banister as he tried to process what he was hearing. "You don't understand," Sarah finally said, her voice so soft that Jack had to strain to hear. "I can't hurt Jack. He doesn't know anything. And I want to keep it that way, but the truth will come out." Sarah, Michael said, his voice laced with a quiet intensity. "He's going to find out, if not from you, then from me." Jack felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. His breathing grew heavier, each word from Michael and Sarah sinking like a stone into his chest. He didn't fully grasp what he was hearing yet. But one thing was clear. Whatever they were hiding could shatter everything he thought he knew about his family. Jack stepped out from his hiding spot, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. He couldn't take it anymore. Michael's words echoed in his mind, sharp and piercing like a blade twisting deeper with every repetition. The truth will come out. It had to come out now. Everything he had just overheard ignited every nerve in his body, a firestorm of rage and confusion. Mom, Michael, what the hell is going on here? Jack's voice cut through the air like a knife as he stepped into the living room. His eyes cold and steely fixed on the two of them. Sarah gasped and spun around, her face, which paled, her expression frozen in sheer panic as though she had been pushed into a bottomless pit. Michael, on the other hand, remained still. His dark eyes flickered toward Jack with a slow, deliberate movement, his face betraying no surprise. It was almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. Jack, you shouldn't have been listening. Sarah stammered, her voice trembling and uneven. Don't tell me to pretend I don't know. Jack's voice rose into a shout thick with fury. I found the letters, the ones Michael wrote to you. And now I hear you two talking about the truth. Someone better explain right now. Michael took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving Jack. He knows, Sarah. There's no point in hiding it anymore. No, don't, Sarah cried, turning toward Michael, her voice pleading. You can't tell him. He can't tell me. Jack let out a bitter, hollow laugh, the kind that cracked under the weight of suppressed emotion. Then who's going to tell me? Mom, are you just going to keep hiding everything like you always have? Michael stepped forward cautiously, raising his hands in a gesture of calm. Jack, listen to me. What I'm about to say won't be easy for you to hear. But you have a right to know the truth. Jack narrowed his eyes, his voice dripping with defiance. Go ahead, Michael. Surprise me. Michael paused, the silence stretching unbearably, as if he were carefully choosing his next words. Your father didn't die in a normal accident. It was my fault. The air in the room turned heavy, thick with the weight of the revelation. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat, his eyes widening as he stared at Michael. His lips moved as though to form words, but nothing came out. I tampered with the brakes on his car, Michael admitted, his voice low and lean with guilt. I didn't mean to kill him. It was supposed to be a warning. I wanted him to stop. I didn't think it would go that far. Jack lunged forward, grabbing Michael by the collar, his hands trembling with rage. You think cutting his brakes was a warning? You killed my father. You took him away from me, from my mom. And now you stand here acting like it was some sort of mistake. Jack, stop, Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. It's not as simple as you think. Jack released Michael with a forceful shove and spun around to face his mother, his voice cracked, roar with anguish. Not simple. I don't care how complicated it is. I just want to know how you could let him come back here after what he's done. Sarah sobbed, her entire body shaking, as she sank into the couch. Jack, I didn't know he'd done it. By the time I found out, it was too late. I just wanted to protect you. I don't need your protection. Jack roared, his voice breaking with the weight of his grief. I needed the truth, Mom. And now I don't know if I can trust either of you or not. Him. Not you. Not anyone. Michael stood motionless, his face hardened like stone. Jack, I've made a terrible mistake, an unforgivable one. But I can't undo it. I'm not asking for your forgiveness. But you need to know your father knew about me and your mother wanted to end it, but I couldn't let that happen. Jack stumbled back, his breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Michael's words hammered into him, shattering the fragile remnants of his past. Everything he thought he knew about his father, his family, his entire life, it felt like it was crumbling before him. He looked at Sarah, who was hunched over her shoulders, heaving with sobs, and then back at Michael, the man who had taken away the person Jack admired most in the world. Get out of my house, Jack said, his voice low but charged with unshakable fury. Get out right now before I lose control. Michael held Jack's gaze for a long moment before nodding silently without another word. He turned and walked toward the door, the sound of it closing behind him, echoing like a final punctuation to the chaos he had unleashed. Jack remained where he stood, staring at his mother as she crumbled under the. Jack stood on the doorstep, his grip tightening around the wooden box filled with old letters as if it were the last remaining tether to his father's memory. Snow was falling heavier now, the delicate flakes settling on his coat before melting into icy droplets. The air outside felt stiflingly heavy. A stark contrast to the relief he had hoped to feel when leaving the house that no longer felt like home. He turned back for one final glance. The house looked the same as always. But to Jack, it was now just an empty shell brimming with lies, secrets, and the ghosts of the past. Sarah stood in the doorway. Her tears, her face is pale, and her eyes are rimmed red. She didn't say a word. Perhaps she knew no words could mend what had been broken. Jack could feel her gaze lingering on him, but he didn't look back. Even for a moment's hesitation would only pull him deeper into the emotional abyss, threatening to swallow him whole. He walked toward his car. But a faint sound from inside the house made him stop in his tracks. It was the creak of a door, his father's study, the one room in the house Jack had never been allowed to enter. He froze, his brow furrowing as his eyes flicked toward the study's window. The curtain shifted slightly as though someone or something was inside. That's impossible, Jack muttered under his breath, a shiver running down his spine. The room had been locked since his father's death. His mother had never touched it. Or so she claimed. But that creak, that subtle movement of the curtain, it couldn't just be the when he could. Jack clutched the box tighter, his pulse racing. Part of him wanted to march back into the house, open the door, and confront whatever was waiting inside. But another part, the part of him that was exhausted, shattered, and desperate for escape, wanted to leave and never look back. His mind spun with unanswered questions. Was there more? Mother hadn't told him what other secrets lay buried in this house and that room. He took a deep breath, forcing the thoughts aside. He needed to leave, at least for now. Space-time. That's what he needed to make sense of everything. The wooden box in his hands felt unbearably heavy, as though it carried the weight of everything he just learned, yet it was also the only thing grounding him in this moment, the only connection he had left to his father. Sliding into the driver's seat, Jack slammed the door shut. The sound echoing in the stillness of the snowy night, a hollow emptiness settled over him as he stared through the frosted windshield. He had no idea where he was going, what he would do, or even where to begin rebuilding his life. But one thing he knew for certain: the letters weren't finished speaking. The final letter, father's unfinished words never sent, might hold the missing piece to the puzzle. Jack started the car. The engine rumble broke the silence and pulled away from the house. The memories and the life he once knew faded behind him as the snow-covered road stretched ahead, but his mind remained stuck on the faint sound of the study door creaking open. Was it just the wind? Or was there something more waiting to be discovered as the car's tires left tracks in the pristine white snow? The questions echoed in Jack's mind, persistent and unrelenting, like whispers from the past refusing to be silenced. He knew one thing for certain: this story wasn't over. And sooner or later he would have to face it all, every haunting truth. Whether he was ready or not.